All right, so for this chapter, I'm gonna try out having a camera on. It might not be my thing, so I might turn it off at some point, or I might hate it and never do it again. But I'm hoping maybe being able to see my face will help some of you to maybe conceptualize, or I don't know, maybe it helps to see someone's mouth form the words. Anyway, we're going to be doing chapter 22, which is panoramic imaging. The learning objectives for this chapter is going to be to define the key terms associated with panoramic imaging, to describe the purpose and use of this imaging, to describe the fundamentals of this imaging. We're going to describe the equipment needed for this type of imaging. We'll describe patient preparation, equipment preparation, and patient positioning procedures that we need to do in order to expose a panoramic projection. All right, so we will describe what a diagnostic panoramic image looks like. We will identify the patient preparation, patient positioning errors seen on panoramic images. We're going to discuss, that's my little robot vacuum in the background. We're going to discuss the causes of those errors and describe the necessary measures needed to correct such errors. And we'll also discuss the advantages and the disadvantages of panoramic imaging. So why are we doing this chapter, right? We need to learn about panoramic images. We need to learn the basic concepts of taking a pano. We need to be able to describe how we get our patient in there, how we get the pano set up. We'll talk about, how to position our patient correctly in order to get a diagnostic panoramic image. Unfortunately, not every intraoral series is going to give us all of the information that we need about our patients. It sometimes it's impossible to be able to see the types of structures or the angles of what we need when we're taking intraoral. And so a panoramic image is the next step. It's the next thing that we need. And so in order to get a completely diagnostic view of our patient, in order to cover all of our bases and have a comprehensive exam on that patient, we may need to do both intraoral and extraoral imaging. All right, so we're going to start off with the basic concepts. We'll go over the purpose and the use of taking a pano. We'll talk about the fundamentals as far as the rotational center and getting the focal trough in perfectly. We'll talk about the equipment that we use and the basic concepts of the basic concepts. We're going to talk about how to properly take that radiograph. It's important to keep in mind that a panoramic image shows us the reason why we do it is so we can get a good look at of both the maxillary and the mandible, the entire arch of both at the same time, all in one image, which is really nice. All right, so the basic concept for the panoramic image is that it shows us a wide view of both our upper and our lower arches, but it's really important to keep in mind that a panoramic image is not going to be as clear or as well defined as our intraoral x-rays will be. So if we need to see something very detailed, we need to perhaps diagnose something very specific and small, then we need to go with intraoral images over a panoramic image. If we're looking for something big that we can't quite capture in an intraoral image, then we're going to be taking a pano. Most of the time, a bite wing or several bite wings are in conjunction with a pano. That way we can see bone level and we can see intraoral, or not intraoral, but interproximal caries. At the same time, we can see somewhat of an image of our periapicals, and we can see the jaws, and we can see all of those other structures all at one time. So we use it in order to see both the upper and lower arches on a single projection, and this is a extraoral technique. We are using the extraoral technique because the actual receptor is placed on, it's not placed inside the mouth, it's on the outside of the mouth, and so that makes it extraoral. All right, so the reason we take a pano is to get that overall image of both the maxilla and the mandible all at one time. There's a ton of reasons why we might want to take a pano on someone over taking, instead of just taking intraoral. We wouldn't do it in spite of taking intraoral, right? I'm going to read them to you straight out of the book. They're on page 244. So the reasons we might do it is to evaluate the dentition and supporting structures, right? We're not going to get a very clear, perfect image of our teeth, but we're going to get some idea. And if we see some sort of abnormality or something going on with that tooth, then we know, okay, maybe it's time to take an intraoral PA of that area or an occlusal radiograph of that area. We might do this to evaluate impacted teeth, right? So most of the time we take panos on patients who have wisdom teeth because we need to monitor those wisdom teeth. It's incredibly difficult to get a wisdom tooth in its entirety on a PA or a bite wing at all. But then when it's erupted, but then when our wisdom teeth are impacted, it's even more difficult to get those teeth on an intraoral radiograph. And so we might be taking a pano to either diagnose that the patient needs to go have those out, or just to monitor and see where those teeth are. We see this a lot too for people who have congenitally missing. So we take an intraoral and we don't know if the tooth is there. So we take a pano to find out, is the tooth impacted or do they not have it at all? To evaluate eruption patterns, growth, and development. So we see this a lot on kiddos. As they're growing, we need to know, are those teeth there? Are they all going to be able to come in? Do they have too many teeth? Some people have supernumerary teeth, and that's something that we need to address sooner rather than later. We don't want to wait until 82 teeth erupt before we start to maybe send them to an orthodontist. We need to be able to detect diseases, lesions, and conditions of the jaw. So sometimes, especially around unimpacted or unerupted or impacted teeth, we see lesions grow. We see some type of abnormality. There are cysts or tumors that grow inside the bone that we wouldn't necessarily capture in their entirety with an intraoral image. So we need a pano. To examine the extent of large lesions. Uh, I was in private practice. I took a couple of bite wings and PAs on patients. I took an FMX on a new patient who came in, and we saw this sort of corner. It was dark. It was radiolucent, and we were like, "Hey, what the heck is this?" So we took a pano on him, and it turned out he had a very, very large cyst growing, back toward the bottom of his ramus, and he ended up having a dentigerous cyst around a third molar that he'd never had removed, and he could have fallen down and hit his jaw, and he would have broken his jaw. It was so pervasive that it's not something that we were capturing with bite wings. If we had only taken bite wings on him, we would have never known. If we had only taken those PAs, we would have probably questioned it, but we wouldn't have known what it was. And then when we took our panoramic, we were able to figure out, hey, you have a pretty big problem here. You need to go to an oral surgeon. We sent him over to the oral surgeon. They did surgery. They filled in that area with bone grafting, and they gave him a plate to hold everything together until it healed. And now he's fine. And he moved on to another hygienist too. Can't believe it. The other things we might do is to evaluate trauma. So if someone has been hurt in any way, a lot of the time we take a panoramic over taking intraoral because the patient's very swollen and sore, but also because we need to see the extent of that trauma. We need to see how far it goes, how pervasive the damage is. And so the images that we see on a panoramic projection, they're not as defined, they're not as clear. We can't use them in spite of intraoral in order to diagnose, but we do use a panoramic in order to have more of a comprehensive understanding of what we're looking at and being able to maybe see things we can't capture with intraoral. By the way, that picture that was on the last slide for figure 22-2, which is on the next page, 245, you're going to want to start getting yourself familiar with it. It's not something, I'm not going to quiz you on the anatomy in this chapter, but we will in chapter 28, we're going to go over the normal anatomy on a pano, and it is something that you're going to want to start being aware of. I would get pretty comfortable, at least expose yourself to each of those structures because it's a lot of material. I'm kind of worried about 27 and 28. So if you want to go ahead and take a quick look at those chapters before we get to week 7, that is probably a good idea. Anyway, the fundamentals for taking a panoramic is that the receptor and the X-ray tube move around the patient's head. The patient stays still. And so the tube head rotates around the back of the patient's head in one direction, and the receptor rotates around the front of the patient's head in the opposite direction, it says. But basically, they're kind of rotating around the patient. So like one's going from right to left and one's going from left to right. That's what they mean there by that. They're connected. So they just sort of both rotate around the patient at the same time. They're not like, going opposite directions kind of thing. Anyway, the patient stands still, or you can have your patient sit in a chair as long as, they're able to have their head and their shoulders into the right position. It doesn't matter what's happening like from the chest down. All right, and here's that image on figure 22-3. You can see that the tube head rotates around the back of the patient's head, and then the receptor rotates around the front of the patient's head. Okay, so the process, the basic concept of the receptor and the tube head moving around the patient is called tomography. And tomography is something we see in other types of imaging as well. It's not something that we use in intraoral. Intraoral is a single image, and it's taken one time at one point in the angle. It's always just one tiny pinpoint of time and x-ray images, right? Tomography is a series of images that will layer over one another. So as the tube head is traveling around the patient's head and the receptor is traveling around the front of the patient's head, that x-ray image is being shot from here and then here and then here and then here. And as it goes around, those images are then overlapped one another in a way that will give you one solid image. This is the reason that there are certain sections that are blurred, because one structure, sometimes maybe the spine or the hyoid bone or some of those other structures, will actually get in the way of the x-ray as it's penetrating in order to get to the teeth, because there's a whole lot of stuff in between the back of my head and my teeth. So as it's going around, some of those other images become blurred and they show up in other sections of our pano. And it's basically, you just need to understand that the x-rays aren't this constant continuous thing as it moves around. It's this single shots as it goes around, and the receptor captures it and then overlaps those images. All right, so in order to understand how a panoramic would rotate around the patient, you have to understand it's rotating around a center, that the tube head and the receptor are both connected at the top, and they rotate simultaneously around it's called a rotational center. In older x-ray units, it used to be like a couple of fixed points that it would rotate around, and then it would rotate around, and then it would rotate around, sort of the way that figure 22-3 makes it seem. And 22-4 is also kind of strange. All that you really need to know is that they're both moving simultaneously around a rotational center, and that your patient is always in that rotational center, okay? I don't like this picture, honestly. It looks as if the tube head starts at the front of the mouth and it slowly moves to the back, but it really doesn't start that far forward. It actually kind of starts more like exactly on the side. So this basically, it just shows you that there is a center point, but that the center kind of moves a little bit as it rotates around, because we're not perfectly circular, right? The front of our head is kind of in an arch shape, right? So we're a little flat on the sides and we're very curvy in the front. And so if we chose just one spot and the panoramic rotated around it exactly, then we would get a very strange image. We're going to talk about that in the next slide, but basically our rotational center has to fall in line with our focal trough. And as we move around, we need to keep in mind like what we're trying to capture and how to get the best angle on that thing we're trying to capture. But this is essentially, it's moving around a center. Your patient's in the center, just your patient's in the center. Okay, so here's the focal trough. The focal trough is a theoretical concept, which means it's not a real thing. It's just the place, the imaginary place, where if you get your patient into it, then it will give you the best image. If your patient is too far forward, you'll get a blurry image. If your patient is too far back, you'll get a blurry image. You'll get weird, warped, weird stuff, right? But if you can get your patient into this perfect spot, then you're going to get the best image you can possibly get from a panoramic image, right? And so you can see here how that jaw is curved, right? Because we understand that the jaw is kind of flat on the side and it's kind of really curvy in the front. So the panoramic, as it rotates around, it's it's making room for this. It's understanding that that is the shape of a human being, right? We're not all shaped exactly the same. So some of us have, wider jaws, some of us have more narrow jaws, which means that the pano is actually set up to take this image on the average person. So if you have someone who's too big, we're not going to get them perfectly into the focal trough. If they're too small, we're definitely not going to get them into the focal trough. If they're really angular, they're not going to be in there perfect, and that's okay. It's okay that they're not perfect, as long as we get them as close to being in that sort of arch shaped imaginary perfect spot as we can get them, then we're going to do fine. So for this one, it's a three-dimensional curved zone in which the structures would be demonstrated perfectly. And the focal trough is a theoretic concept which determines where the arches should be placed in order to get that best image. It's also known as an image layer, which just means that one tiny layer of space where the image comes out well. The patient's jaw should be positioned in this zone in order to get a clear and well-defined as well defined image as we can get. Every panoramic that is made, sometimes it has slightly different variations as far as where you're supposed to place your patient. Most of them are pretty similar. And so we'll talk about some of those concepts in this chapter. But if you're using brand spanking new machine, it's always a good idea to just check it out and see like, what do they want me to do with my patient? Okay, so we get a couple of different images when we take our radiograph for our pano. First up is the real image. So the real image is the structure that's in between the receptor and um, the the tube head, right? The source of the whatever it is. It's inside our rotational center. It's actually in our focal trough, and it's what we're hoping to capture. So typically here it's the jaw and the teeth. That is inside the focal trough. That is the real structure, the one we're trying to get. Usually there's not as much distortion for this structure, whatever it is. It looks the way it's supposed to look, and that's a real image. It's the structure where it's supposed to be. That's what we're trying to get. The double image is when a structure is actually located behind the rotational center. So it's closer to the tube head. It's not inside the focal trough. It's not something that we're trying to capture, but it's just it's in the way. So it's going to show up on our receptor because it's in between the X-ray tube and the receptor. So it's going to show up because it's there, but we're not trying to capture it. And so what happens is it shows up actually on both sides of our image receptor. This is usually like the spine or the hyoid bone or the epiglottis. These are structures we're not trying to see, but they typically show up because of where they are. And then the last one is a ghost image. And now a ghost image is something that gets in the way. It's not in our focal trough, so it's not supposed to be where we're looking for it. Typically, it shows up higher than where it actually is because of where the pano is placed as it goes around. It has a negative vertical angulation. And so it's kind of pointing up a little bit. And so if whatever it is in the way, it shows up too high. This is like by the hard palate. There's a couple others. Let me think. The ramus of the mandible or the hard palate, and because they're not in the focal trough, they show up blurry. They typically show up higher than they're supposed to, and it's almost like they don't look real. They come in very distorted usually, and they're too close to the X-ray source. They're not something that we want to see, but they do show up. Sometimes they even overlap other structures that we're trying to see because of where they are for the receptor at the time that the X-ray passed through them. It also occurs with earrings, or if your patient has any type of other piercings or necklaces, things like that, they'll show up on your X-ray in places that you don't want them to. They'll be blurry, and they're not really where they say they are, right? So a necklace that might show up would show up like across the top teeth. Is a necklace across their top teeth? No, it isn't. It's a ghost image because it's there, but it's not supposed to be where it says it is. Anyway. So this is a YouTube video that if you go into the PowerPoint that you can download and then you click on this, it'll take you to a YouTube video that will show you some of the setup for how to take a panoramic, how that works, what it looks like. He's using a little bit of an older machine, certainly older than the one we have in clinic. I'm going to make a video. I'm going to show each of you how to take a panoramic on our clinic pano machine. And this one is fantastic though, because a lot of offices here in San Antonio are still using the ScanX. It uses a PSP plate or a photostimulable plate, and it is what you will use to take a pano in private practice. So wherever you go, whatever type of machinery that they're using, you're going to want to at least be aware that those things exist. Usually they'll show you how to do it though, so you don't have to worry. All right, equipment. So first up, we have panoramic X-ray units. We're going to talk about the film. We're going to talk about the intensifying screens, which we talked a little bit about when we talked about cassettes and all that stuff back when we were in chapter 9, I think, on how to run these things through the processing stuff. And then we'll also talk about cassettes. Intensifying screens are usually in cassettes, but we're going to talk about them separately. So there are a number of different panoramic X-ray units. There's so many. Every office you go to has like a different, completely different version of them. The one we have is actually very nice. It is one of the newer units that I've seen. I've seen a lot of older units. I have seen one that's even nicer too, and you like set up your patient and then you push the button, and while it's like going around their head, it sings Beethoven to the patient, which I always thought was really cool, like really extra. But she had just bought that unit like 2 years ago, so it's still like super new. But anyway, they all have the same components, no matter what kind of X-ray unit you're using. If it's traditional film, if it's PSP plates, or it's completely digital now, they're all going to have these specific components, which is the X-ray tube, obviously, the head positioner, and the exposure controls. So most of the time it's all in one. You can see that picture, the little dial at the bottom with the blue screen and the little buttons next to it. That's the exposure controls. It's how you choose, is your patient an adult? Is your patient a child? It's how you're going to be able to choose, are you using digital or are you using traditional film? It's also going to be where you can push a little button for a light, and most of the time that light will show up on your patient and it'll help you kind of guide them to be right in the center, up or down, depending on where you need them to be. Then it has those head positioners, which is where the patient rests their chin. They usually bite on a little stick. They have the blue things at the top that kind of squish their heads in. And then it also has the tube head and the sensor, right? It's going to rotate around the head. So usually they have to like kind of work their way to get into that space. But for the most part, they're all the same. So the tube head on a panoramic X-ray is very, very similar to the tube head that's on an intraoral X-ray machine. It's exactly the same. What's inside the tube head is the little tube. It has an anode, it has a cathode, it's sending X-rays, it's sending electrons, it's doing all of this exact same stuff, okay? The vertical angulation for that tube head is negative and it's not adjustable. The only thing that you can adjust on a panoramic is the patient. So you can put how high or how low the patient is supposed to be, but the tube head is set on its vertical angulation. It's always going to be the same. It's always going to go around the back of their head at the same angle, no matter where you put your patient, okay? In order to get the angle right, in order to get your patient, the x-ray, the radiograph that you're looking for, my goodness, you need to get your patient in correctly and set the machine up correctly. The collimator is really the biggest difference between the x-ray tube for intraoral and the x-ray tube head for extraoral radiographs is the collimator. And it differs, you might see this on your board exams, by the way, in that it is a tiny, narrow slit on where the x-rays are able to escape, right? And that's important because remember, we're using tomography and the x-rays all have to overlap one another. If I had big old circular images and I had to overlap all of those, it would kind of be a problem. So if I have just this narrow little vertical slit as it goes around, it's going to give me a better overlapped image, okay? So the collimator on a panoramic is a narrow vertical slit. Okay. The sun is like officially coming through this window, so now it's getting really hot in here. The panoramic X-ray units. Okay, so the X-ray beam emerges from the panoramic tube head through the collimator as a narrow band, right? Narrow vertical slit. We just talked about that. It passes through the patient and exposes the receptor through another vertical slit in the cassette carrier. Not all cassettes are made the same. Not all of them only expose just a tiny little bit of the cassette as it goes around. But usually the cassette sits in a portion of the machine, the receptor holder, right? And so as it passes through, as it goes around, it opens up a different section of the cassette as it passes. So it's able to pick up only certain sections, and you're not accidentally sort of spraying the entire cassette with x-rays at the same time, right? Because of those scatter radiations, that will cause a lot of fog on our film. So we don't want that. That's probably not something that you have to really think about too hard. Just kind of understand it only exposes the section as it goes around. The vertical angulation is fixed, which we just talked about. It's different from intraoral, right? Because we can change the vertical angulation on our intraoral radiographs, but we cannot change the vertical angulation on our extraoral or panoramic radiographs. The head positioner of your X-ray is usually a chin rest. It has a notched bite block and it has a forehead rest and lateral head supports or guides, right? All of those different things we talked about when we were looking at the picture. That picture, by the way, is figure 22-7. You see it on page 248. You'll also see the patient in there for your figure 22-8. You can see how she's biting on that little stick. Sometimes it has a little place for them to rest their chin and then they bite on a stick. This one shows us one where she just bites onto the stick. It's notched. It's very important that when you have your patient bite down onto the bite block, that their front teeth, their four central incisors, all bite into that little notch. That will make sure that your patient is not too far forward or too far back. Sometimes when you get your patient in there, you say bite on that little stick, right? They go like, and they bite way too crazy. So make sure you're like, okay, bite. Now slide your teeth back until they fall into this little notch. And then they will, and they'll be in there, right? Also, you want to make sure, too, that they're not like this, and they're biting like that. You want them to be straight up and down, right? So you'll have them lean forward to where their forehead will come all the way up and touch the little forehead rest. And then what I like to do is kind of squish them into the middle so that they can't be too far side to side. And so I actually reach up and like push the things in until they touch their head. And I'm like, okay, I'm just making sure you're okay. and then I go take the x-ray. So it's used to align the patient's teeth as accurately as possible because we want our patient's teeth to be in the focal trough as best as we can possibly get them in. All right, so here's that picture I was talking about, that figure 22-8. You can see she is biting on the bite block. She doesn't have a chin rest in this one. That's okay. That's totally normal. Also, she has her hands up and she's holding on to those rests. We do this for patients because some of our patients are a little bit bigger. They're a little bit like, fuller. And so when they reach up and grab, actually, they kind of hunch their shoulders just like this, which means that the back of their shoulder is going to actually be hit by the tube head when it comes around. And so what we do is we have our patient hold on to those headrests and we have them put their shoulders down, because sometimes when you put patients into it, they feel very like insecure in there, like they're going to fall down. I'm not really sure how that works. But anyway, have them put that in there. And then what I like to do is have them walk their feet forward. So they're really like having to hold on, and then they're not going to do this on you. You can see too, she has that little line going across. That is something we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. It's called the Frankfurt plane. I don't like using the Frankfurt plane. I'll talk to you about a different plane. But for the purpose for this one, that little line shows up and it should be parallel with her across the front. That way you know she's not too far up or too far down, because that will cause us a lot of problems later on. It's important that we get our patients in there correctly so that their teeth are in the focal trough. Okay, so the exposure factors, we're going to be using the milliamperage and the kilovoltage that are recommended by the manufacturer, and they will accommodate our patients of our different sizes. Sometimes you can adjust your exposure time so that you can get, a patient maybe who's a little larger or a patient who's a little smaller. And the exposure time can be adjusted based on the type of image that we're looking to take. on a panoramic, we're always looking to take a panoramic image. There are other x-rays you can take with them, but we're not going to ever do that. And it's really just about making sure if you have a larger patient or you have a smaller patient, you're able to adjust those exposure factors. The panoramic imaging varies usually depending on the receptor and the x-ray unit, but it always will run from anywhere between 10 to 30 seconds depending on the patient. So it really just depends. You're going to hear that either a beep or, maybe your office is nice and you hear Beethoven. Until it stops, you hold the button until you hear either the beep or the song stop, then you let the button go. All right, so you can take a panoramic with either a film, a photo stimulable plate, PSP plate, or you can take it with a direct digital sensor. At our clinic, we have a direct digital sensor, which means you set up your computer to receive the image. You have your patient open, the DEXIS open, all that stuff. Once you have that green screen that says it's ready for the exposure, then you take your panoramic. If you're using a PSP plate, then you won't have your computer set up first. You'll take the x-ray, you'll have it in its cassette, you'll go over to the computer, you'll pull up your patient, you'll turn on your scanner, and then you'll run the PSP plate through. Typically, PSP plates are sensitive to light, but they're not as sensitive as traditional film. So you don't have to worry about opening it inside a dark room or anything like that. You can open it in a regular light and just immediately run it, and it won't have any effect on the image. Now, if you were to leave it out and let it just sit out in regular light, not inside its cassette, then it would over time degrade your image. And then the last one is film. Now, film it's usually screen film. Remember, we learned that in chapter 9 when we talked about panoramic film, and it's always screen film because it takes less time to expose than it would with traditional film, right? So screen film is used, and screen film always has to be used with an intensifying screen. That's why it's called screen film, okay? And what it does, screen film is sensitive to light. It's not sensitive to X-ray photons. And so you put it into a cassette. There are 2 intensifying screens inside the cassette holder, and it will change the X-ray film from photons into light energy, which will then expose your film, and then it will create your latent image for you. It's important that you do not open these cassettes in regular light. That will ruin your film, right? Because it's light sensitive. So you need to open your cassette inside a dark room or inside your daylight loader if you're using traditional or screen film. It's also going to be really important that your cassette will have either your cassette or your receptor, whatever it is, has a marking that has a little R and a little L that will show you the right and left sides of your patient. In intraoral film, we use all of those anatomic landmarks in order to determine which side of the mouth we're looking at right there. But with the pano, we have no way of knowing. So unless we have intraoral x-rays that tell us, the patient's missing number 19, and then we look and we're like, oh, okay, 19 should be on this side. Let me flip it over. We don't have a way to know which side is which. So it's really important that your cassette or the receptor, something along the way, has been marked with an R or an L that will help us orient the film correctly. All right, so here it is again. Image receptors. Extraoral screen film is used in film-based panoramic imaging. It is sensitive to light, so it needs to be placed inside a cassette that has intensifying screens, and then it's usually placed in between 2 intensifying screens inside the cassette holder. Cassette holders can be flexible or hard, by the way. Just keep that in mind. When it is placed inside there, it must be marked with the right or the left. We just spoke about that. And then it comes in 2 different sizes. So either a 5 by 12, it's always in inches, by the way, or a 6-inch by 12-inch cassette. Like the size of the film is going to be like 5 by 12, or it's going to be 6 by 12. Okay. All right, so there are 2 different types of intensifying screens because there's 2 different types of film. There is screen film that is sensitive to blue light, and then there's screen film that's sensitive to green light. The blue light one, you need to have an intensifying screen made out of calcium tungstate. The green light one, you need to have an intensifying screen that is made out of rare earth. Okay, the rare earth intensifying screen will emit a green light. The only one that is used in dental radiography for panoramics is going to be the rare earth for green light because it requires less X-ray exposure than the calcium tungstate screens. It almost hurts learning things that you won't really need to know, like how we don't use calcium tungstate and how that calcium tungstate emits blue light. But what you do need to know is that it could show up on your boards. And so calcium tungstate intensifying screens are bad. They are not the ones we're using for dental because they emit blue light and it takes too much X-ray exposure. So rare earth. I know it sounds so weird. I read that and I was like, rare earth it sounds like it's made up, but it's not. Okay, so the cassette is what holds the film. It also holds a receptor for like a PSP plate as well. It holds the film and it holds an intensifying screen if you're using screen film, right? It can be rigid or flexible, curved or straight. The one that I used in an office was flexible, and so we would like take it and we would like wrap it around the little part of the X-ray thing, and so that was nice. It has to be light tight, no matter what kind of cassette it is, even if it's a photostimulable plate. It has to be light tight because over time the light will degrade the image. And it needs to be marked in order to orient the finished image, right? So the cassette is what is marked with either an R or an L, or sometimes it's both the R and the L, and it helps us to orient the X-ray once we're done taking it. If the cassette is not labeled before the exposure, the film must be labeled immediately after processing using a marking pen or an adhesive label. This talks about labeling our X-rays once the film comes out of the cassette. It's really important that it's labeled immediately because otherwise you'll forget who that X-ray is of, and you'll forget what day you took it. So it's really important that every X-ray, when you take them, they're put into a mount, or especially with a panoramic, you write on it that it is the patient that it is and the day that it was taken. Only 37 minutes later, we finally made it through the basic concepts. So now we're ready for the step-by-step procedures for how to get our equipment ready, how to get our patient ready, and how to position our patient inside the panoramic machine. Before we expose our panoramic, we have to remember about infection control. By the way, don't forget about that one. It needs to be clean. You need to set up the barriers. Then you put your patient in, you take your patient back, you clean everything up. Okay, don't forget about that. We don't really talk about it as much, but don't forget about it. Okay, so this is procedure 22-1. You can find it on page 249. And basically we get our receptor ready. We either load our film or we turn on our computer or our digital image, and we load the cassette. If we're using film, we would load the cassette up and we would put it onto the panoramic machine, depending on the manufacturer settings and how you would load the cassette. Then we prepare a bite block. So we're always, always, always going to cover the bite block, right? Because we don't want our patient's mouth touching something that someone else's mouth touches. So we cover the bite block with a disposable plastic cover slip. And if it's not covered with an impervious material, the bite block has to be sterilized between patients. So I worked in an office where there was a little plastic little bite block that you actually took off and you sterilized it. So whenever you were getting it set up, you would grab a sterilized bite block and you would put it onto the X-ray machine. So whatever office you work in, whatever type of stuff you're doing, the bite block, either it has to be covered with something disposable or it has to be sterilized. It has to be heat sterilized. Okay. And then choose exposure settings. So you need to make sure that most of the time you can't change your kilovoltage or your milliamperage on a pano, but you'll change your time depending on the patient's manufacturer settings and depending on the size of your patient. And then you'll adjust the height of the machine. So if you have a super short patient, you might want to lower it down. That way you don't have to spend 10 years waiting for the machine to lower on its own. Some of them, if you leave it off, you can just easily slide it up and down. So that's what I would do. I would turn the machine off and then I would put it down and then I would turn it on and it would like lock it into place. And then I would like do the small adjustments, but you learn as you go. Okay, so we explain to our patient what we're going to be doing, why we're taking a panoramic. We get their informed consent, right? Full disclosure, informed consent, all that jazz. We place the lead apron on them that does not have a thyroid collar. You cannot use a thyroid collar with the digital, with the panoramic. Film, PSP, digital, you can't use a thyroid collar with a panoramic image. It is recommended that you use the double-sided lead apron, so the one where there's a lead apron in the front and there's one on the back as well, because your patient is standing up and they're not back up against a chair. And then you're going to remove all of the objects from the head and neck area that might interfere with the procedure. So some patients wear their necklace and it's like nice and low and it's like, kind of a far out, and that's okay, especially if they're not like hunched at all. Some patients though, they kind of hunch their shoulders and it will pull the necklace up into the area. I tell every single patient I see, if you're wearing a necklace, your necklace has to come off. Everything from the collarbone up, if it's metal, it has to be removed. All right, so we get our patient in there. They have their forehead against the forehead rest. They are biting into the notch on the bite block, and their chin is resting on the chin rest. We instruct our patients to stand up nice and tall as possible, with the back straight and erect, shoulders down. Instruct the patient to bite onto the bite block. You position the mid-sagittal plane perpendicular to the floor. Where is the mid-sagittal plane? It's this plane right here, right in the center. If we were to break our patient right in half, that mid-sagittal plane is right in half, this half and this half, okay? We want that to be perpendicular to the floor, right? So it's got to be at a 90-degree angle, like this is the floor, this is my mid-sagittal plane, right? Anyway, so we want that to be perpendicular to the floor, and we make sure that their anterior teeth are falling into the grooves of that bite block. All right, so the patient positioning. This is where we talk about the Frankfurt plane. I don't like the Frankfurt plane. I think it's dumb, okay? The Frankfurt plane is supposed to be parallel to the floor, right? And the mid-sagittal plane should be perpendicular to the floor. The Frankfurt plane is very hard to perfectly line up, okay? So I'm going to give you a new line, okay? And this one is from the ala of the nose, the nostril, the side of the nostril, the little phalange on the side there, not phalange, blare on the side, and the tragus. Okay, on this guy, it doesn't look exactly perpendicular. They just drew him weird. He's a drawing. And you're going to line up the ala with the tragus here. And that is going to be perpendicular to the floor. It looks like it's at a totally different angle, but on a real human being, this isn't weird, okay? So you're going to line up the ala of their nose with the tragus of their ear, right? The little part here. Some people get this pierced. And so it's a lot easier for people who understand kind of piercings, as far as this being the tragus of the ear, the little flappy thing in the front. And then the ala tragus line. You're going to hear me say this a lot because I hate the Frankfurt plane. I think that the Frankfurt plane is not exact, and it's not as precise. It's harder to line it up the way that you want it to be. So your book talks about the Frankfurt plane as it passes through the floor of the orbit and the external auditory meatus. That does not sound precise. Anyway, that is where you're supposed to get your patient lined up. All right, so once you get your patient in there, their mid-sagittal plane is lined up, their alatragus line is lined up, not their Frankfurt plane, then you're going to have them in there straight. You're going to get everything all smushed up against their head. Then you're going to have them smile, so you know that they're completely biting onto the bite block and that their front teeth are falling into the notch. Then you're going to have them close their lips around the receptor. And you're going to tell them to position their tongue to the roof of their mouth and keep their tongue there during the whole exposure. Most of the time what I say is close your lips and swallow, because that will cause, when a patient swallows, they actually push all the air out of their mouth, so the air actually leaves their nostrils and their tongue will fill the space. Usually I just say that and it happens. If you don't have them fill their mouth with their tongue, so you don't have them, kind of get rid of all of that air space, you're going to get a weird air space on your panoramic image. So it's important that you tell your patient either close their lips and swallow, or to close their lips and place their tongue to the roof of their mouth. Sometimes people will do this thing where they just place the tip of their tongue to the roof of their mouth. They'll do this. You don't want that, okay? You want them to completely fill the space of their mouth with their tongue so they don't have any air in there. You tell them to close around it. You tell them to stay still. My goodness, they have to stay still during this exposure. It's only 10 to 15 seconds. Nothing is in their mouth. I don't know why they'd have to move. And then you're going to proceed with exposing the receptor and process your x-ray. That's pretty much it. So if at any time you forget how to do this, you're going to refer to procedure 22-3, which is on page 250 of your book. Okay, so here is a woman placed in here. You can see here she doesn't have any of the light on the little lights that show up. With our panoramic, they show up as little red lines on it. And so what you'll do is you'll make sure that she is biting. See how her front teeth are falling into the little notch here on this bite block. Once you know that that's happening, you'll have her close her lips and swallow, or close her lips and fill her mouth with her tongue. And then you'll want to make sure that her mid-sagittal plane is perpendicular to the floor, right? These lines are really nice because it's in the center of her chin, it's in the center of her nose, it's in the center of her lips, right along the philtrum and the tubercle there. And then you'll have it make sure it goes right in between her eyeballs. We're looking at her from an angle, so it's a little different. This is also a light that kind of wraps around the head, so it's not exactly perfect when you're looking at it from the side. But you'll also make sure this is a little bit high on her here and here. But if you kind of line up this ala of her nose with the tragus, oh, I kind of marked up a little bit, the tragus there, see how they're both blue? You will get the image that you want. You will get the perfect curve of SPI on your patient, the smile line that you're looking for. If you try to line up the bottom of her orbit is somewhere between here, well, I guess that's a little high, is right there, and where you think the bottom of her orbit actually is based on bones, right, which is somewhere down here, right, and then her external auditory meatus, that's the hole that's here, somewhere in here. So you're trying to line up some of this with something in this. It is very not exact. It's not exact. It is, ugh, I hate it. It's vague. So ala tragus. Line those up. You'll get it right every time. All right, so now we're going to talk about what makes up our diagnostic panoramic image. It results when the equipment preparation, the patient preparation, and the patient position are all completed correctly. It should be free, ideally, from all errors, and it must demonstrate accurate anatomic features and proper exposure resulting in correct density and contrast. Such an image is not always able to get. You can't always get a diagnostic image off of a panoramic based on your patient. So if your patient is very large and their focal trough their teeth won't fall into the focal trough, not a whole lot you can do there. If they're tiny, they won't fall into it. If they are, really angled, their ramus kinds of pops out really far, you're not going to get it. And that's okay. All right. It's just important that we get as close to a perfect diagnostic image as we can possibly get. All right, so the anatomic features. This is the best part of panoramics. So the panoramic image has to allow for the visualization of the maxillofacial anatomic regions that it represents. Each panoramic image should be assessed to determine if the dentition and the bones of the maxillofacial region are representative. This means, do the teeth look like they're supposed to in this image? And did you capture all of the facial bones that you were supposed to capture? That's what that means. We're going to look at box 22-1. You'll find it on page 251. It's going to break down all of the separate areas of what a panoramic should capture into little sections. And it's really, really nice. It breaks them into areas. There are 6 areas of the panoramic, and each area should have these different parts. It also says 22-16. Yes, there it is. No, 22-16. I like 22-15 at the bottom of 251 because that shows you, kind of has a little bit sharp of a smile line there, but that's okay because it shows you really, really good density and contrast. Figure 22-16 is, it's overexposed. It means it's too dark and we can't see the differences of the teeth, and we'll talk about that in a second too. All right, so density and contrast. I know you thought we weren't going to have to talk about this anymore. but we still do. So in order to get a diagnostic panoramic image, we need to have a correct exposure time, and we need to have proper density and contrast based on those exposure settings. So if we have a smaller patient, we need to have less exposure time. If we have a larger patient, we do higher exposure settings, right? On an ideal panoramic, the density, the overall darkness is not excessive, and it's not under excessive either. Like we need not underexposed or overexposed. Proper contrast on a panoramic image is critical because it should allow for the identification of the junction between the enamel and the dentin, the little line, the dentino-enamel junction. We should be able to see that little line, and we should be able to see, like we would look at x-rays to figure out whether the cavity has extended from the enamel into the dentin. We should be able to see that line on our pano, but only in the molar region. Anterior teeth are a little bit different because of the focal trough as we go around with the pano. So we don't expect to be able to see perfect the dentin and enamel junction in the anterior, but in the posterior, we need to see it. If you look at figure 22-15 at the bottom of 251, you'll see that is a perfect density and contrast. They're smiling a little too excessively, right? They had their chin tipped down just a little, allotragus line, but with contrast and density, they use the correct exposure settings here. For 22-16, that is an overexposed image. 22-17 on the next page is an underexposed image. You can see how both of those, there's just really not a lot of detail in the back around those molar teeth. And so it's really important we're getting the right exposure settings. 22-18 is like perfect exposure settings. All right, here is those two images I was just talking about. So the top one here is the overexposed, it's too dark. The bottom is underexposed, it is too light. And in both of these, we don't have the proper contrast because I cannot see the line, the dentino-enamel junction between those back teeth. In fact, all of that enamel is just one solid color, right? Getting the right exposure settings is very important so that we can see all of that area. If you get the wrong exposure settings, you're going to get this. This is called burnout, and there's just no detail to it. Okay, guys. Errors on panos are so much fun to look at. Okay, I love looking at errors on panos. So here we go. The first one is we're going to talk about patient preparation errors, and we're going to talk about patient positioning errors. This is going to be great. We need to avoid these types of errors, even though they're fun to look at. We need to avoid these errors when we take them on our patient because they do make our radiograph undiagnostic. We would have to retake the image. That would be terrible. The pano is actually only less exposure than an FMX, right? It's more exposure than single images. So having to retake an entire pano is actually not a good thing. We don't want to do that to our patient. ALARA, right? As low as reasonably achievable. So we want to avoid these errors by putting our patient in correctly and by setting up the pano correctly, even though we like looking at the errors when they're done. Okay, so patient preparation errors means we didn't properly prepare our patient beforehand, right? So in the first one, we see some ghost images, and in the bottom, we see a lead apron artifact. Okay, so in the top one, you can see that patient has earrings on their ears, right? And on one side, it looks like the earrings barely showed up, but then on the other side, it looks like there's like twice as many earrings here. So I'm not really sure what kind of earrings this patient was wearing. Maybe they were wearing two totally different ones. I don't know. And then in the bottom image here, you can see this big white mass right in the middle, or right on the bottom, sorry. That is a thyroid collar because whoever took this pano put a thyroid collar on their patient before they took a pano, and it covered up part of the structures we're supposed to see. That's not good. So we need to have our patients remove earrings, tongue rings, partial dentures, dentures, full dentures too, and retainers. We'll have to have them take off any necklaces. We'll have them take out bobby pins from their hair. The clip, people have like plastic clips. Plastic is okay. Usually that doesn't show up, but the little metal springs that like hold the clip together, those will show up on your x-rays. So you're going to have them take out anything from their hair. Sometimes women don't like taking their hair down when they come in for the dentist, and you just need to explain to them. If you're like, okay, I need you to take all that stuff out of your hair, and they're like, no, then you just say, it's going to show up on our x-ray and it's going to cover the images that we need to see. There's really no point in taking this x-ray if you're going to leave that stuff in your hair, and we really need this x-ray. So, you need to do it. And usually they comply. All right, so back to ghost images. Earrings would show up as ghost images, and it's anytime an imaging artifact is seen on a panoramic image that is produced when a metal or a dense object is penetrated twice by the X-ray beam. Sometimes it's found on the opposite side of the receptor, and it can appear indistinct, larger, and higher than its actual counterpart, which means it just looks different from how it really is. And a lot of the times it will show up in an area that it is not actually in. So this picture is really nice because the earring does show up kind of like over by where an earring would be, but I've seen them where it'll show up kind of like over here, and so you don't want objects in the way of taking your pano because they won't come out the way you want them to, and sometimes they'll cover up the stuff you need to see. So things that you should remove: failure to remove earrings, dentures, or other radio-dense objects will create ghost images on your pano. Don't do that. So the problem with ghost images is that they result, whatever it is, produces an image, and it will obscure diagnostic information. In order to fix this problem, we make sure they remove all radiodense objects from their head and neck region prior to exposing them. You can also discuss this with them and let them know it's going to show up. Most people kind of get, hey, anything metal from the neck up is pretty easy to understand. The lead apron artifact. This one is sometimes hard for patients to understand because patients now are very educated and they understand that a thyroid needs to be protected from radiation. And so I've had several patients who get into the pano and they're like, wait a second, my thyroid's not covered. And you have to explain to them that this x-ray, you can't have that on there. It's going to obscure part of our image. And some of them are okay with it, and some of them are, they're just not happy about it, but that's okay. So you will wear a lead apron. My goodness, you will wear a lead apron. Typically, the double-sided apron is recommended, but do not use a thyroid collar. The radiographer can place the lead apron lower around the patient's neck in order, like sometimes they'll like hold it up high, and that's okay. Like if they're holding it up, but don't let your patient pull the regular lead apron. Don't let them pull it up to cover their thyroid. Let them know we need to see that hyoid bone. And then it shows up as a cone-shaped object, which obscures the diagnostic information, especially along the bottom of the ramus, which is an important aspect that we need to see in the pano. And then we just use one without a thyroid collar in order to fix this issue. All right, so this one is patient positioning errors. It's the most common. My goodness, it is the most common error that you can make. Positioning of the lips and the tongue. So sometimes, you're in a hurry, you're not thinking about it. You automatically assume, you've said it a million times. Why doesn't this patient know how to do this? And so sometimes you leave out certain things that you'll say. And so if you forget to tell them to close their lips around the bite block and you forget to tell them to swallow or, fill that space with their tongue, then they won't do it, they won't know, and so then you get this kind of dark image across the front of the teeth because there's an air space there. Sometimes you'll tip their chin up, right? Sometimes they're in there weird and you just can't get them quite right. And so sometimes their chin will be tilted up, sometimes their chin will be tipped too far down. And this is the part where that allotragus line or the Frankfurt plane really comes into play. Sometimes they'll be too far forward or they'll be too far back, right? Because we want their anterior teeth perfectly biting into that notch on the bite block. Sometimes that's difficult for patients to get. They bite onto it and you're like, okay, slide your teeth back until they fall into the notch. And they like go forward and you're like, no, the other direction. Like go back up. They're like still going forward. So just people are fun to kind of instruct. And so make sure that their anterior teeth are falling into that focal trough. Now, posterior teeth can be sometimes difficult. What happens is that if you don't get your mid-sagittal plane perpendicular to the floor, they'll be tilted a little bit side to side, right? And you don't want that. Sometimes patients have neck problems and they just can't quite get in there, right? They're just permanently crooked. I'm a little crooked, you know, and so you just do your best to try to get that. Now, if they go in and they're not even, like they're biting on the stick, but they're like biting over here, right? And so here's, you know, hold on, let me get the pin. Here's where the center should be, but I'm over here. It's actually going to blur one side of the posterior teeth. So make sure when you are putting your patient in that mid-sagittal line, the little line that will show up on their face, is actually cutting them right in half, right along the center of their face. Sometimes they'll have their head turned. They don't usually turn this way, but sometimes they'll be in there crooked or they'll be tilted, and don't do that. The biggest common, the most common problem that you'll have with patients, especially older patients, is that they're slumped like this. I'm terrible. I have such terrible posture. And so I also have this problem, but you really want to make sure that they go in there and they stand up straight and they put their shoulders down. Sometimes, especially older patients, they're kind of permanently slumped. They're like little hunchbacks, not humpbacks, my goodness. And so they'll be there in crook. They'll just be in there. And when the PID, the tube head comes around the back, it'll actually bump into the back of their neck or the back of their shoulders, and it will cause an issue. It'll cause like a giant white line in the center of your image, and so you do not want that. So make sure they're standing up straight, because if they're slouched, it will be bad for you. Even the very smallest error can cause a distortion on this. So make sure you're being very particular when you're setting them up. It's not uncomfortable for them to be there, so make sure you get them in just right. So if the patient's lips are not closed around the bite block during the exposure, then a dark radiolucent, I don't know why it says dark radiolucent. Radiolucent means dark. Dark radiolucent shadow results that obscures the anterior teeth. Okay, so that is why it's caused from an airspace. So we'll have that airspace right in the front, and it will cause a big dark sort of smudge right across the front teeth. You don't want that. If the tongue is not in contact with the palate during the exposure, it will also cause a dark radiolucent dark shadow that will obscure the apices of the maxillary teeth. So it is very important that you have your patient close their lips and swallow, and they will not have that problem. So make sure you're instructing your patients to do that so you don't get that dark radiolucent area on your pano. Okay, so this is what it looks like when your patient's chin is tilted up too high. You get this like weird thing because the teeth naturally in the posterior will curve. Your occlusal plane does naturally, with the curve of SPE, curve up. And so if you put your patient in with their chin too high, their anterior teeth are curved this way, but their posterior teeth are still curved because that's how they are. So you're going to get this reverse smile line image on your pano. The solution for this is to completely ignore the Frankfurt plane and to line up the ala tragus line parallel with the floor. This one and having the chin tipped down are the two most common errors that we see on panos. These are the two places where you will lose points on your panos almost every time. So make sure you get their ala tragus line, Frankfurt plane, lined up, okay? That way you don't have this problem. When you tilt them up like that, you're actually pulling their anterior teeth out of the focal trough, which if they were tilted down, they were in there, then we would get a nice sharp detail on our anterior teeth, right? But because they're tilted up and they're outside of the focal trough, they're blurry like that. I mean, I can't even tell that this patient has anterior teeth. So don't do that. All right, and then this one is if you accidentally tip your chin down too far, right? They're looking down when they're in there. Then you get what's called an exaggerated smile line. It's very apparent. In fact, can you see how much of the spine we're actually seeing now? Because when you tilt your chin down, you actually pull the back of that spine into the rotation of your tube head now, even more so than it would have normally, and everything looks smushed together. So don't do that. Make sure that you get your Frankfurt plane or your ala tragus line parallel with the floor, so they shouldn't be tilted up and they shouldn't be tilted down. They should be parallel with the floor so that you can get the proper image. All right, so also we have to worry about that the teeth are anterior to the focal trough. So what happens is they bite on it, but they're too far forward, right? They bite, but they're not in the notch. And so if the patient's positioned too far forward of the bite block, the anterior teeth will appear skinny or out of focus. Can you see how very thin those teeth are in this image here? Of these teeth, right? That was a terrible circle. I'm very sorry. These teeth here are very skinny and they're thin, and it looks like they're a little bit more blurry than, well, this side also looks pretty darn blurry. This is just a terrible image. But also, everything, when you go too far forward, everything is kind of out of the focal trough from where it's supposed to be. But anyway, the thing that you need to know is if you're too far forward, the anterior teeth will appear too skinny and out of focus. That is the important aspect here. Okay, so if they're too far forward, then in order to fix this issue, we have to have them slide their teeth back until they fall into the groove or the notch on the bite block. And in order to do this, we put our patients into the focal trough. Just a reminder that the focal trough is this imaginary curved space shaped like a horseshoe that we need our patients' arches to fall into so we get the right detail on this image. And what happens when we don't get our patient's teeth far enough forward is that, again, they are not in the focal trough. The anterior teeth are not. And so the patient's teeth are positioned too far back, right? You can see her teeth here are behind the groove. I don't think I've ever seen anyone do this, but you never know. Sometimes patients might not want to bite onto it. No, I'm not sure. Anyway, if they're too far back, then the anterior teeth you can see here are too fat and they're out of focus. So if you don't get the anterior teeth into the focal trough, they will be blurry. If they're too far back, they're going to appear too wide. If they're too far forward, they're going to appear too skinny. In order to fix the issue of having them too far back, you're going to ask your patient to move forward until their teeth, their anterior teeth, fall into the groove or the notch that is on the bite block. Okay, so I had to turn the camera off for this one because I wanted you to be able to see this image. So if your patient comes in here and they're not perfectly centered, where that mid-sagittal plane is cut in half by the little light for it to be perfectly centered into the pano, then you're going to have this issue where one side of the teeth, the posterior teeth, are too skinny and one side are too fat and they're really blurry. Can you see here how much wider the A side is from the right side is from the left? Because one side is getting way too much magnification. And so this, if your patient comes in here crooked, which I don't see this too often, usually once you go in there, there's a little mirror and then there's a little light and people just kind of automatically line themselves up most of the time. But it's important for you to make sure that the light is centered right down the center of their face. And the solution for that other problem is this one right here, to make sure that this mid-sagittal line, this is a terrible line, it centers the patient, okay? So it should fall directly between the two eyes, right in the center of the nose, right down the philtrum in the maxillary, or the cervical here, right down the center of the chin to, if they have one of those like little butt chins, you want them completely cut in half so that you get that even distribution between the two arches. So make sure your patient is centered. Don't worry, I let my cat into the room. He's fine. So this problem is if your patient is slumped. If they're slumped forward like this, then they will have this giant thing right in the center, this white smudge right in the center. This is their spine. This is where the spine actually is, but it's usually not in the middle of our focal trough, so we usually don't have to worry about this. But we do here. This patient is also doesn't have any teeth, so that's why you're not seeing any teeth back here on this patient. That's they just don't have any. So the problem here is that they're slumped, and the solution is to have them sit up straight so that their spine doesn't get in the way when we take this image. All right, I promise we're almost done. So the advantages of panoramic radiography is that we get to see a lot more in our field size. Our field size is like the area we're looking at, right? We get to see the entire maxillary arch, the entire mandibular arch. We get to see all of the structures around all of those arches. We even get to see, the bottom of the ramus. We get to see the bottom of the orbits of the eyes. We get to see a lot of different structures with the panoramic image, which is really nice even though it's not quite as detailed, right? And then we have more simplicity with our images. So what's nice about that is that it's easy to tell what's what. Hello, lady. We have more patient cooperation, right? Patients are more comfortable. It's not as difficult for them to, oh goodness, she's really messing things up for me. It's not as difficult for them to get in there. It's not uncomfortable for them. And then also when we take just this one panoramic with some bite wings, it's actually much less exposure than if we were to take numerous FMX images. Um, so a lot of those structures are on the image at one time. I'm not recording all of this again. I'm getting kind of tired, so she's just gonna have to stay on this camera. And then we need to learn how to, learning how to take the panoramic is pretty easy. It's very straightforward. You know, get your patient in there, right? Line them up. There's a light. Usually it's pretty easy for the radiographer to get them set up. And then most patients actually prefer taking a panoramic to the intraoral because they're more comfortable, right? You're not, you know, putting very large sensors into their mouths. All right, and so anytime we have advantages, it means we probably also have disadvantages. Um, one of the disadvantages is that the image quality is not quite as good, right? There's a little bit of blurring and there's a little bit of distortion that we see on a panoramic image over intraoral radiographs. The focal trough has limitations, right? If our patient isn't the proper size or shape that the focal trough wants our patient to be, then we're going to see a little bit of distortion from that. Distortion is the other one. And then the last one is equipment costs. And this means that it's very expensive for a dentist who is, you know, straight out of school or is opening their own practice to buy this very expensive machine. It's more expensive than probably anything else that they have in the office. And so, you know, I talk about the one who has the panoramic that sings Beethoven to her. She's going to be paying on that piano for many years. So it's, you know, it's important to remember that our dentists are putting out a lot of money. They have a lot of overhead for the things that they have. And so, you know, when they don't buy you the latest, greatest equipment, or they're not constantly buying you new stuff, or, you know, they say maybe no to giving you a raise, it's because they have a lot going on. So keep in mind, panoramics are not as sharp as intraoral radiographs. The structures they have to be inside the focal trough in order for them to not have that distortion. And yeah, I already said the panoramic is more expensive. So yeah, it's not perfect, but it is certainly a wonderful adjunctive sort of aid to taking our radiographs. That's it. I'm very excited that this is the end of the video. I'm sorry that it ended up being a little bit more than an hour. I do try to keep the videos to be shorter than an hour because I know you usually have to watch about 3 of them, if not more. And so anyway, if you have questions, if you have concerns, anything like that, please send me an email, post it in the question and answer discussion board. I know I already have missed one of those just because you guys haven't been doing it very often. So if I don't answer you right away, my goodness, like, you know, send me an email, like yell at me. It really, just anytime you reach out and talk to me is going to be a good thing. So if you have questions, please ask them. And other than that, that's going to be it for chapter 22.